Yeah, and
And
what the funny thing is too, I think I had looked for, because there's always certain things that I want to make sure I give really good photo reference to Philippe for, you know what I mean? Because I have a very specific sort of, look in mind, and I want to make sure I can communicate that the best way is a piece of reference. So I was looking, for quite some time for essentially little black books that were filled out. Like it was a tough thing to sort of find reference for, but I eventually found one that was perfect. It was Sammy Davis Jr.'s little black book. Somebody had laid it down. So like some of these numbers were like, again, these are like celebrities who've been dead for 50 years or whatever, but it was fascinating. Like, like all these different names over in there. We had to edit them a little bit so you couldn't tell what it was.
okay, everyone, I'd like to welcome Jeff McComsey to the Asylum. He's our latest guest, and we're going to talk about his new, I guess it's a limited miniseries, Little Black Book. All
Hey,
right,
how's it
so
going?
Jeff, great. So welcome to the Asylum. How's everything?
Not too bad. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So let's jump right into it. Tell us about Little Black Book.
So, Little Black Book it's a 4 issue miniseries. Issue one, I think, just came out this previous Wednesday. Essentially, what it's about, the genre that I like to write in most, and I've done mostly for AWA. This is the third project that I've done with AWA. It's sort of a small town crime genre. I just like the idea of like there's these sort of absolute villains that lurk around the corners all over this country, all over the world, right? And sometimes they're in little. I mean, we often learn about them when they're in like big cities, of course, New York and all points in between. But I like the idea of like just these little capers that we get mixed up in the small towns. I just feel like I grew up around those kind of things, and they were always sort of popping off. I mean, you're generally hearing about them after something's happened or whatever. But I just like the idea of small town crime, sort of low stakes, but like still pretty serious bad guys. You know what I mean?
Right, that you're kind of like taking me back to my Friday night viewing back in the '90s. I can't remember what was like those shows where were like a true crime show. I think Keith Morrison, a former Canadian correspondent, used the narrator, but it's always
Mhm.
about some murder or someone done wrong, and then at the end of the hour, it kind of gets wrapped up a little bit.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. I grew up with those too. We would have them, in the states. It was like the movie of the week, right? Like we hear something happen, something terrible happens in the news, and like a month, 3 months later, some sort of like hastily produced film dramatization of it comes out, and you see it, and you're like, oh, that is pretty terrible. I mean, this is sort of like how we sort of learned about these things, like you're right before the internet, right? Like, oh, okay, I saw the made for TV movie for that. I know all about that one. Now we just sort of jump around from news article to news article. And I think Fargo, a big influence on me is the film Fargo. And I felt like Fargo when it came out, I think probably younger people that see it now don't have that connotation of like that sort of grim movie of the week. And like these people, this really happened to people. We changed the name. They were lying about that, which is probably my favorite part of the movie. But we were used to sort of like, oh no, this is a terrible thing that happened to these people. And I like those kinds of stories, and they've always been like a big inspiration for me. And generally, and not that Little Black Book isn't directly inspired by anything that happened in real life, but I'm often sort of have one eye open as I'm sort of surfing the web for like those little odd tales of like small town crime that bubble up into the national view for every once in a while.
No, yeah, totally. And I got that same feel when I was reading it. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I was going through the issue and meeting all the characters and seeing how things are just kind of slowly unfolding, it kind of felt like it was like Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul adjacent kind of a universe
Oh,
where
absolutely, absolutely, and sort of the idea of one. I love the locale. I love that sort of it's sort of you get a teaspoon of the neo western with it. With the sort of big skies and Monument Valley and all that kind of stuff. And again, just like one of the things I love about that show, both of them, is they were a textbook example of just those villains that lurk around the corners in those small towns that you would never think twice about if you passed them. You know what I mean?
yeah, exactly. But like I keep thinking of like Mike Ementrout
Yes,
from
yes, no,
Breaking
definitely,
Bad,
definitely. And
where
even like I remember when I was first talking to Axel Alonso and Michael Coast, the editors at AWA about it. That is sort of how I pitched this Johnny Boy character, who's the father of Cole, who we meet in the beginning of the first issue, as sort of like a Mike Ehrmantraut esque kind of fixer for somebody else.
right, right. And then I guess, sometimes it's hard to not bring your work home. And that
Right,
spills into
exactly,
exactly what
exactly.
happens to everyone else in this tale. So choices and family legacy play a big role in the miniseries.
Mhm.
Without getting spoilery, what can you tell us about how that helps drive the narrative?
Sure. I think one of the big things is we have Cole, who we find out hasn't heard from his father for 20, 25 years, zero contact. I mean, as far as he was concerned, the man was already dead. And Cole is a straight arrow, right? Like he's just a normal guy, job, wife, she's pregnant, they live in a house that's too small. Who among us, right? But the thing that I like about it, or my original thinking is that he would inherit something from his sort of criminal father. And the question would be like, how long would it take that thing to turn him into somebody he never thought he could be, or like what impact is that going to have on this relative straight arrow? Like it becomes this corrupting influence, and then we sort of talk about in the first issue the reason essentially that Cole's father left the family is because he kind of foresaw his corrupting influence on the boy, and I like that even sort of in death. Through death, this thing has reached out and it's still sort of there, right? It's sort of this thing that can still corrupt his son. And that's sort of what the first issue is about, is sort of how that comes to be in his son's hands and sort of, what, if anything, they do with it.
Yeah. And the thing that I found really kind of interesting, I guess it's just the way that the fates kind of lead you one way or another, is that he's a straight arrow. He's trying to do right. You can tell that his mom, through the flashback, is really stressed with the situation that she's in. And he's trying to do right by himself as an adult. But it's one fateful decision based on one thing that a character says. And I don't know if I want to say it because I don't want to spoil it. But if he just turned left, like there's a great panel. And I think Philippe did a great job of just kind of showing how small both characters were in that moment. And I'm not sure if you understand if you remember or know what I'm talking about, which where Cole's wife is talking to him about what he should do after they've been visited by the lawyer.
Right.
And it's like, even the way that it's lit, it's like there's light on one side, dark on the other side. And then you don't actually, like, you leave the scene early, which is great. And then you see how everything kind of unfolds.
Yeah, no, that was a big I specifically remember that scene, and I think when I had originally scripted it, there was a little more after that. But that's always the question: like, when's the best time to sort of jump out of the scene? We've told the viewer what I want them to know essentially, and there's a question I want to leave them with, and that was it. Absolutely, what do they do? Of course, we will answer that later on. But I love that sort of 3-page in between where we're like, I don't know, like what's going on here. But no, that was a big favorite scene of mine. One of the other things that I love too is just something Philippe did with there's the big splash page when we see inside the little black book, and we can kind of read along with the intros. And that was sort of that was a big group effort between like myself and Philippe, and then Michael Coast, who's our editor at AWA. One is a big thing with like you can't use actual phone numbers. This is a big thing with AWA. I'm sure this is policy on all big comic companies, but anytime we use a real number, they're always like, "Hey, can you make that something that's fake?" Which is fine. But I remember Mike being sort of insistent that we made sure that the area codes matched up with the sort of listed area codes at the top. And then I think I went through and did sort of like some like some notes that he had scribbled in, like X's through some names and like little notes above somebody else's. But that was a great one. It's just rarely does the art. Although I am an artist myself, I didn't do any of the art on this book. But rarely does the writer sort of get to sort of contribute even like little red marks, in the comic. So I was quite pleased about that.
Yeah, and I think I kind of took from that's double page spread is it's almost like a Where's Waldo, and then will any of this come to fruition later?
Right. Yeah, and the funny thing is too, when I think I had looked for, because there's always certain things that I want to make sure I give really good photo reference to Philippe for, you know what I mean? Because I have a very specific sort of, look in mind, and I want to make sure I can communicate that. The best way is a piece of reference. So I was looking, for quite some time for essentially little black books that were filled out. Like it was a tough thing to sort of find reference for, but I eventually found one that was perfect. It was Sammy Davis Jr.'s little black book. Somebody had laid it down. So like some of these numbers were like, again, these are like celebrities who've been dead for 50 years or whatever, but it was fascinating. Like, like all these different names that were in there. We had to edit them a little bit so you couldn't tell what it was. But, there were definitely a couple of famous names in there that we had to edit a little bit. But it was perfect because, it's also sort of, we've lived in the era of like Palm Pilots and digital calendars for years and years and years and years. So even just sort of finding somebody who still sort of keeps a traditional sort of calendar book and reference for it was kind of tricky. But we found one, and Philippe took it and just ran with it.
It's kind of interesting that you mentioned that because like it's a neo-noir, and like when you think about, I guess, when that genre first kind of kicked off, it was a way simpler time. You had your femme fatales, the basically it was stuff in black and white, or it was the pulp novels.
Mhm.
And technology really wasn't part of the storytelling. It's all about the people.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting now having a modern neo-noir
Yeah.
where you've
Yeah.
got that kind of intrusion, but the black book cements his dad at in a certain time and a
Right.
certain way of thinking.
Right, and also too, it's not something that you can like hack or anything like that. Like it's a thing you have to have. Like you need possession of that. Of course, you can copy it, but for the all intents and purposes in this story, like it's a thing that you would have to have. And one of the things that's interesting about this story is, in spite of the fact that we have this little black book that's sort of a little archaic, is I like the fact that we kept it contemporary, and things like cell phones and things like that still play a part in the story. But I don't feel like they detract from anything from it, because that's the tricky part. The previous stuff that I had done for AWA. I'd done one called Grendel, Kentucky, which was like 1970 is when it took place, and then one called The Fourth Man that took place in like 1991. So again, like I think that definitely sort of the smartphone changed the game for a lot of different things as far as plot contrivances go. But I feel like for every window or every door that gets closed by new technology, one gets opened by new technology. Just for instance, with this one, I don't know. You've only read issue 1 so far?
Only issue 1, yes.
Gotcha. So not to spoil anything, but in issue 2, there's a part where we use like one of those little key fobs, that
Yes.
open your. I love those. I think they're really great for like different sort of devices in comics, and when we use it later on, I just think it works. It's one of those little pieces of technology that I think doesn't hurt, right? Like it's a new one that I think works really well.
No, that's great. And it's kind of interesting, like, because neo-noir, like that whole genre is slow, right?
Yeah.
Like slow reveal. And we're kind of like in a really like a blitz pre kind of age where like everything's like flashing quickly and get to the meat in a hurry. And I can tell you, like, every 2 pages I was reading this, I was like, okay, that's a question mark. Okay, so that's another question mark. There's another question mark. And so I had so many kind of unanswered things happen or that I came across in the story that I'm like, even though really not a lot happens, so much does.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing too with number ones. Obviously, they're sort of like making sure you get the premise across, and what the little black book is, and he receives it. Relationship with his father. One of the things that I really like about doing the 4-issue mini specifically, all the series that I've done with AWA have been 4-issue miniseries, is that we really like outline the crap out of them. Like they are extremely sort of like, and just to use the term, like there's sort of zero fat, I think, on these stories. I'd like to think at least, and that I'm aware of those questions that we're sort of raising in issue 1, and knowing that as I'm working, I remember working on issue 3 and 4. There were certain scenes where I was like, there are 3 things that need to be answered, sort of indirectly. Of course, I mean that's writing, right? Like we want to make
Yeah.
it seem like nonchalantly answered, but it's important that certain points get hit to sort of even just give a little bit of whether it's sort of wrapping something up or bringing something back around, or maybe it's making that third joke about something. I would have this sort of checklist for stuff. I feel like the 4-issue setup. Again, I mean that's the big part is like issue 1, sort of asks a lot of questions to get those primed. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a big fan of the 4-issue miniseries. I feel like that's the way my brain works with a lot of the stuff I think about now, like in terms of just sort of different stories that I've got cooking up. I like it. You know what I mean? I feel like I might meander. I might sort of decide to meander a little bit more if I had, 6 issues or something like that. But the 4 is like, no, no, no. It sort of forces you to make that decision, whether it's good or bad, or to have something or not have it. You know what I mean? Like, sort of clarifies, I guess, is the way I'd put it.
Well, sure. It just makes everything, like you said, you want to cut the fat. Everything's just leaner. So there's nothing wasted, right? Like, I guess
Right.
if this was a film, there's nothing on the floor that you've cut.
Exactly. And that's sort of what I think about. I look at every scene, every line of dialogue. Like, does this have to stay in to make or break the scene? If yes, it stays in. If no, we can lose it. You know what I mean? Sort of how I approach it. And I think that works for stuff like Little Black Book. I don't know if that would be the right approach for everything, but for something that's sort of again like a neo noir, sort of terse. With characters who are sort of terse for the most part. These are sort of laconic Southern gentlemen for the most part. You know what I mean? So they don't just sort of ramble on about stuff, and I like that sort of permeates the story too.
And so with the structure that you've chosen with 4-issue setup and payoff, how does that or what's your writing kind of process like, especially since you are an artist as well too, because I
Mhm.
draw as well too. So when I write, I almost envision my pages as I'm writing them. It's like, okay, I know I can fit this much on a page, and the art won't be kind of compromised, and dialogue won't be compromised. Do you do the same kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's one of the biggest one too. Is obviously it's sequential art. It's about sort of the juxtaposition between the text and the pictures, and it's knowing that sometimes one has to outshine the other, and sort of knowing when that is, and knowing when you want to back off one and lean on the other. I would say definitely making being very conscious of when I'm asking for too much in any given panel, or it's too many panels asking for too much on a page. That's a big one. You know, what I mean, obviously, you want to keep it down to the one action at a time stuff, but even then it's like if I'm asking for you to convey the emotion of a character, I can't ask for this to be a giant wide angle shot. Like we need to be up close to register that. And I know just as an artist, like there's a certain size where I can make sure you'll recognize the character. But if you want them to be like like really convey an emotion, like I need to have a relative close up. And I need to make sure that's sort of built in there without it being sort of cluttered. And I feel like with Philippe, he's again, Philippe's an artist that I've worked with previously. I had years and years ago, I had a zombie anthology that I did. A bunch of different people had done stories for it. Philippe was one of them, so I was sort of familiar with him and his work before that. But I also think too, like an artist who writes, I'd like to think at least you probably have to ask Philippe this, but when there are the occasional notes that we give, I feel like they're very executable, right? Like I'm definitely taking into like I'm not asking for like willy nilly redraws on panels and stuff like that because I know personally how long that stuff takes, right? So if I am asking for something, it's usually something that I have a very specific note for that can be very sort of easily adjusted. You know what I mean? I think that's a big one. I know the general process with this with the stuff that I do for AWA is it sort of starts small and gets bigger. So it's initially like a 1 to 2 page sort of outline of where I see what the story is to get sort of the initial people interested. They're interested to like, okay, we need something more substantial to take to get approved. That ends up being more like a 10-page document, and that one I'll break into issues. That's the only sort of delineation. Like, here's what's in issue 1, here's issue 2, here's issue 3, here's issue 4. The one that I do after that is then take each issue and break down each scene. So like, this has, this issue has, well, I don't know, like 8 scenes in it. And then from that, I can kind of break down and figure out how many pages I think I need for each one of these. And I think that's something else that helps, sort of with an art background is I sort of know how to frame things if like suddenly, oh, I only have 2 pages to do this, like what those most important images are versus if I have a little extra time to do that. So just sort of knowing that stuff, it definitely makes me more confident, and I think I'd be a lot less sure of myself if I didn't sort of have that direct experience, knowing like the time that goes into it. Because I mean, if you've done comic art, then you absolutely know it takes forever. You know what I mean? It takes a really long time to make comics. So I try to sort of minimize anything that would result in like essentially wasted time and effort. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a big one.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because like, you're writing and you want to change a sentence. That could be 4 hours of work for an artist.
Right, exactly. You know what I mean? And that's one too. And Philippe's one who does like me personally, like I with my thumbnails, I do them like very, very detailed. Like all my compositional stuff is figured out there. And Philippe's got a really sort of very loose thumbnail style. So the thumbnails that he would send over, I'm like, it took me about maybe an issue before I was like, okay, I totally get what this is going to look like when I get those pencils. You know what I mean? Because I found that I was sort of over art directing these loose thumbnails, not really taking into consideration that like he's got all that. You know what I mean? This is just to kind of show us the placement, give us a rough idea of what we're looking at. So that was fun too. And I think the biggest thrill for me being an artist who writes is there's always that way I kind of imagine the page, and it almost never looks like that when I get it back, and I love that. Or there's something where I was like, this is going to be so tough to do. Like, man, I wouldn't want to draw that. And then I get it back. It's this really awesome, simple solution. You know what I mean? Like, I love
Yeah,
being
totally.
surprised by stuff like that. It's always really cool.
Now here's a question: do you ever find it when you're getting pages back from Philippe? You said that, okay, fine, it wasn't how I imagined it. Because sometimes when I draw something, it's not like how I imagined it. Like I can
Of
see it in my
course, right.
mind's eye, but then when I draw it, it doesn't work. But or work out the same way, but it still works. When you get anything from Philippe, is it almost like, oh wow, you really took that to another level? Like I saw it
Oh,
this
yeah,
way,
absolutely.
and then it's like, you killed it, dude. You totally killed it.
One of the things about the story is some of it you've already seen, but like a lot of it takes place in the outside, essentially like in the Arizona desert.
Mhm.
And he just ran with this stuff. Like they're gorgeous. Like these exterior shots there that make up sort of the bulk of the third and fourth issue are just really wonderful. And Marco Lesko is the colorist, and again just took it and ran with it. And those are the things because I just personally me rendering sort of like rocks and all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't say something I struggle with, but it's tough. And I feel like Fleet just made it look super easy and it looks gorgeous.
Yeah, and speaking to your colorist and in your letter as well too, the whole team does a really great job in issue one. It's kind of like when you're putting together a film and you have like a DOP, you have your writer, director, like the artist is kind of like the cast, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of discussions do you have, even like on the lettering stage or with the coloring stage? Do you have any input with that, or you just kind of let them run with it?
I would say less so on the lettering. We work with Steve Wanza is the letterer for this one, and he's lettered other stuff that we've done, and he's awesome. You know what I mean? As far as the sound effects and stuff like that, most of I would say sort of the art direction talk was between sort of Philippe and Marco, and really just getting the color palette down. And we're seeing a lot of these locations in different times of the day. So sort of getting the color temperature and all that stuff right is something that they were working out together. Every once in a while, we would have a note on it. And one of the things that I love about coloring comics, I do a little bit of, I do enough of it to know it's really hard. And the people that are good at it are wizards. But I guess it was last week I got my comp copies of number one, right? So this is the first time I've seen it in print. And that's sort of the hallmark to me of a good colorist is like, you can create stuff that looks great on screen. The trick is making sure that makes it on the way to the paper, right? Because it's not just a one for one. And just seeing his stuff in print, it looked even better. You know what I mean? So I'm like, this guy knows the score.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. Same thing with our colorists. We're really fortunate, Nikos and Mike, who color our book. It's one of those ones where like it's almost like you'll get them, and I guess like in film, if you're going to say film again, they're like you get the rushes almost, where you're like, oh, that looks great, and then you can't wait to see what it looks like. But then you're never sure what the gamma on your screen is, and
Yep.
then what the printing is, and then the paper, and what the saturation is going to be. But you're right. When you're dealing with pros, they're able to have that translate through all
Right.
those
They can
processes.
recognize a color on screen and say that's not something that'll translate or that won't print well and sort of make their adjustments from that. That's the thing I don't know, right? I'm like, this looks great. And it'll be 85% there if I sort of get it to the offset printer. Mostly if I'm doing like some of my smaller self-published stuff, I'll usually I tend to love to work in grayscale. That I have no problem. I can make those grayscales look the same between one or the other. But when you get into the color, it's a whole other animal. And if I
And
can, I leave it to the pros, most definitely.
right, most definitely, most definitely. So you said this is your fourth project working with AWA?
I said third, but you are right. It is actually my fourth. I did Grendel, Kentucky was a mini series. I did The Fourth Man and then the Little Black Book. And the first thing that I had done with AWA was a one shot for sort of like an AWA owned story, which was called ETER. So the concept was essentially like Men in Black, but it's a hospital. So this was like a big sort of sci-fi story. This was a lot of fun, and this was the first thing that I actually got to work with Axel Alonso on. Just sort of back and forth. Of course, I'm a big fan of stuff that he's edited in the past. It was like a big thing for me. Of course, I hit all that. But it was just we hit it off. Like we had the story idea, and I felt like I nailed it. I must have nailed it because they kept working with me after that. And it was a lot of fun. And that one actually came out. That one came out a little after I think the first book. So like they had it, and for various internal reasons were doing other things, and then it eventually came out. So that ended up coming out I think after Grendel, but I had done it before everything else essentially.
So what's it like been from day one to now working with AWA? Have they allowed you a little bit more freedom now that you've done some projects with them?
Yeah, well, what it comes down to is I know that AWA has a bunch of different writers that they work with, and I'm probably, if I'm being honest, one of the least credentialed ones. You know what I mean, as far as that goes. And I know that Axel likes the small town crime stuff that I do. So I generally try and make sure that if I'm pitching them something, that it sort of fits in that framework somehow, knowing that sort of at least in their minds like that's sort of a spot they don't have filled out by somebody else currently who's doing stuff for them. So I think it fits in there, A, as something novel for them, and B, I also think just stylistically it's something that Axel likes. And every time I pitch him these ideas, of course there's stuff that they passed on, but the stuff that they sort of resonated with, that have things that they sort of, right away, sort of like, I like that aspect of it. And I love the fact that they can sort of see, like, a bunch of different ideas, but like, that's the one, you know what I mean? Like that one's got something to it. And for me, it's nice just having those two, Mike and Axel. Um, I can bounce ideas off them, and I know if two of them like an idea, or if the three of us like an idea, it's good. If two of us like an idea, it's possibly it's promising. If only one of us likes it, it's probably not a great idea. You know what I mean? So like, if I can get a consensus from them on something, like I'm good, I can roll with that. And for me, with my process, the part that I sort of like enjoy the most help with, from an editorial standpoint, is I can come up with a concept, I can come up with a story, but the thing that I sort of always take the most time on, and I can occasionally spin my wheels on, is the plotting of it, right? Like, there's a million and one ways to roll this story out. And what I love about them is they just give me just the bare sort of like guardrails to think about. Sort of what makes for four better. What's going to make this work in 4 issues? What's going to make sort of what's going to hook people initially? And once I have just that little bit of sort of like framework, I can just roll with it. Like plotting and sort of characterization dialogues, those are the things that I feel like I do really well with. But it's that initial sort of like, how do we roll this story out thing that I always love getting their feedback on.
Right. That makes total sense, because like I guess that every writer has their own strengths, right? Sometimes it's like you can write really great dialogue, but you might not write great action. And sometimes it's just finding the beats within the page limits. That
Absolutely. And with Axel, I mean, Axel's a guy that I know has worked on and thought through like a million and one comic stories. So like, if he says like, yes, this will work, then I believe it. You know what I mean?
right,
And
right.
so far it hasn't failed me.
Yeah, totally cool. And so you say that like they like your small town crime kind of
I
dateline.
think, I mean, you would absolutely have to ask them, but this is how it feels to me, right? Like that sort of fits in, and it's something that they definitely want to make sure is included with AWA. So when they
Right.
sort of get these kind of pitches, that they're receptive essentially. Whereas I think there are some other publishers that are always sort of very much looking for that really kind of big concept thing. And small town crime is certainly not that. Although these could be great stories, and they could have lives past comics and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's just not quite large enough for certain companies. And AWA could very easily be that company, because they have stories that have that sort of larger than life sort of capacity to it. I like that they put those out, as well as also doing sort of smaller stuff too.
Yeah, no, totally. Like I'm a firm believer that all types of stories need to be told. Like you need your, I guess, tentpole, 12-issue miniseries where things are blowing up, or it's aliens or whatever, capes and tights. But
Right.
then you also need small stories.
Exactly.
Um, Different kinds of audiences need different kinds of entertainment. And so for you, outside of the small town crime, what's your kind of favorite area to dabble in when it comes to writing?
And it's one that isn't wildly popular, but I would say like historical fiction. Particularly spy stuff. Like, generally I feel like spy stuff and crime stuff are almost interchangeable in terms of like themes and how it's actually sort of put forth the types of characters we get. But generally stuff like that with sort of relatively grounded characters that are sort of existing in some sort of semblance of the world as we know it. Although like I said, those are the things that I generally read and watch, and I'm sort of all about. But I also love sci-fi stuff too. You know what I mean? Like just that aspect. I love when you can, because I feel like sort of that sort of spy and crime stuff. When you can plumb those types of things for your sci-fi stories, I feel like it adds something to it, right? And I feel like what I mean.
Exactly.
Like Andor is a great example of just from a Star Wars point of view, just sort of keeping within the Star Wars world, focusing on a much sort of smaller story. Did you see it by chance?
You said Endor?
Andor? Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I know of it, and so I
Yeah.
totally know what it's all about.
It is fantastic. And just to give you a quick example, it's a smaller story to where there's a scene where we have this sort of group of people that are like hiding from the Empire, right? Like every Star Wars story. And they're hiding from a TIE fighter. And just because of the trappings of the story, and this is just one TIE fighter doing a patrol, it's the scariest the Empire's ever been. So essentially it takes that giant sort of lens that we see with like, Star Wars was always about sort of the biggest stuff going on in the galaxy, and just showing us just a tiny piece of it, right? Like there's corners all over the world where like crazy stuff is happening. I like that aspect of it, and I just think that's a good example of where like sort of a big concept company took sort of a small concept and just it worked, right? Like at least for somebody like myself. And I know like I'm a 42-year-old man, so I have my personal taste and stuff, and maybe a 20-year-old would think differently, but who knows? I thought it rocked, but
Well, no, but I don't think you're wrong at all, because I'm a little bit older than you. I'm in my 50s, early 50s, and it comes down to like, how does the story affect you as a person? How does it affect the audience? And we're just basically dealing with people. And your analogy for spy versus small town crime, basically a spy movie is governmental crime.
Right,
essentially,
exactly. It's
right?
the stakes are more or less the same, you know what I mean? It's low key, but there's things happening behind the scenes and
Yeah,
all that kind of good stuff.
yeah. The bad guys have more money when it comes to a spy thing because you're dealing with national budgets versus a crime syndicate in a state, right? But
Exactly.
essentially, it's like you got to get something, you got to protect something, and what's the cost to achieve your goal, right? And so
And
when you're
also too, it's about a character. It's like usually there's a character, it's a person, it's people, right?
right, it's all about people all the time. So, and if your story has heart, then it's going to work for sure.
And that's one too. And I know that like there are times where like just my writer mind where I'm sort of always sort of half kind of trying to come up with the next thing that I'm going to pitch. I generally sort of I've been gravitating towards these larger concepts, and it's something actually that and Axel had sort of given me this piece of advice, and it's not even like complex or like crazy esoteric. He was just like, hey, you know, you should do a few stories that sort of are of the similar vein. So, and again, his reasoning is completely simple and brilliant. It's just that way other people get to know you for that, and then they come to sort of expect those things from you, and it's just a way to build a fan base. And like coming from like a sort of, you know, small press independent comic background, you know, I make comics all the time, like whether anybody reads them or not, who knows? But like the idea of like a man who's sold millions of comics being like, no, this is how you kind of get some folks to read it. And you know, for me personally, one of the things I love about AWA is it's a great comic company, and these books hit the shelf. You know, AWA never screws around as far as like if they say a book's going to come out, it's probably done. And those you will get all four of those issues. Like there's never going to be like, oh, sorry, that book never made it out, or you only got two issues of it. You know, it's very professional in those regards, and I love sort of having something that I can tell, you know, folks that this will be in comic shops this day, and you can order from previews and sort of all that good stuff. You know what I mean? I feel like that's sort of a big thing that they've got wired very tightly, and it's just nice having just growing a readership. You know, I've done stuff that again has had readerships before, but I would say probably in the past 5 years, it's just great to sort of have. I also think the AWA, because like I said, you know, some of the talent they have at AWA, they bring their own readers with them, right? Like they've got a bunch of people that have been reading, you know, Straczynski and you know Mike Diodato stuff. Like they'll see their names and they're like, I'm in, you know, like that's it. So I love the idea of just like, you know, being able to sort of, you know, have people sort of look around with the good company, I guess.
Well, no, and also too, I just want to touch back on your independent kind of like, I guess you can call it your beginnings.
Mhm.
How has that informed not only your storytelling, but also how your career has moved from that and now working at AWA? Has it altered anything in terms of like, I'm going to maintain the way that I tell my stories, I'll take advice from my editors, or is it
Mhm.
like I'm now in a certain area and I can tell stories with a louder kind of voice?
Well, you know, it's interesting for me. You know, doing this stuff with AWA, I kind of compartmentalize in my mind, at least. I'm like, okay, this is my writer stuff that I do. And I like the fact that it allows me to sort of, it gets my name out in front of other people that might not have seen it before. I don't know why I've never really been able to marry the two, like the artist stuff that I do versus the writer stuff. Like it's almost two different hats that I wear. So whenever something comes out from my writer stuff, I'm like, hey, this is great. I can use this as an opportunity to get my artwork in front of other people for freelance stuff. Because in my heart of hearts, like I'm always a freelancer. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like it's like whether it's writing or it's illustrating something, you know, it really doesn't make much of a difference to me. You know, I know that like I would definitely say that there are still at least there's always a project that I'm doing that's like something I'm writing and drawing for myself. And what's fascinating about those projects is the process for those looks nothing like anything I do for AWA. You know, essentially when you're working for a company and they're paying you essentially, you know, you're ticking off all those sort of process things like here's the outline, here's this, here's issue one, like all that stuff obviously gets turned in before the book gets done. You know, when I'm doing it myself, there's really, you know, generally there's no sort of timeline like that. I might start just working in thumbnails first, and like that's how I develop it. And I tend to notice that because of this, you know, I don't think that the stuff that I write that way is worse, but it definitely feels different. Like
Yeah.
it takes a little bit more time to itself, I guess, and ultimately because I'm the one drawing it, I'm okay if I go 2 or 3 pages without saying anything, right? I'm just showing stuff. Whereas, you know, generally speaking, I probably wouldn't do something like that for something like AWA, although it has happened before. I just wouldn't unless there should be a really good darn reason for it for me to do it there. You know, so basically, I would say the big difference is, you know, my writing's different when I draw, but I still feel I guess it gives me more confidence in what I'm doing, right? That like I feel like I must be, you know, essentially trusting myself that like, you know, this is a neat idea theoretically, right? And I should spend my time finishing it. That's my big thing is sort of, you sink so much time into these things, as you well know. The most important thing I think is to finish them, right? You know what I mean? Like, 150 hours sunk into something would be a tragedy if you just sort of, you know what I mean? But if you do something, even if it doesn't hit, even if it doesn't find the audience that you're looking for, you still completed it. It's a thing, you know what I mean? Even if it's just for your own edification, or, best case scenario, it's something you can hand off to somebody else. It's a sample. But sort of always making sure that if I start something, I finish it. Has definitely been something that I've developed over probably the past 10 years or so. And AWA stuff has definitely helped that.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great to hear. And sometimes you never can tell, right?
Right.
Because you might finish something and you'd release it, and maybe whatever marketing, timing, it just doesn't work, but it doesn't mean the story won't resonate. The audience just isn't ready to discover it yet.
Right. And as a big movie fan, like, I mean, probably most of my favorite movies are films that weren't giant hits when they came out. But they were done and they're out, and generally they've been sort of acknowledged later on. But I love the fact that like they're still out and they still did them, and I totally know what that's like. Where it's hard not to sort of conflate sort of commercial success with success. The money's great, and that definitely tells you did something right. But it isn't the only thing, right?
No, totally. And so I'm just going to wrap up, and in doing so, I want you to kind of give a little bit of a tease to the listeners and
Mm-hmm.
anyone viewing. What can we expect moving forward for Little Black Book?
So, and this is one because there's a giant spoiler in the middle of it,
So
and
don't give us the spoiler.
yeah, so absolutely not. But I would say, definitely pick up issue 2, and you will see by the end of issue 2, sort of the worm is turned, and I feel like you'll know by the end of issue 2 if you should get 3 and 4. Of course, the
Right.
answer is yes, but
Of
it is
course.
definitely a dynamic change in the middle of the book that made honestly it a lot of fun for me to do. And it's been tough because like I can't talk about it essentially what our story is about. You know what I mean? Like sort of I can only talk about kind of the genesis of it and where it starts at. But it does. The worm turns in issue 2, and I think you guys will like it.
All right. Looking forward to it. Really enjoyed issue number 1 and looking forward to number 2. Jeff, I want to really thank you for coming by the asylum. Wishing you the best of luck. And where can people find you? Do you have like a Instagram or a website?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Just, Jeff _ McComsey. You can find me on there. And also jeffmccomsey.com is my website where I have a bunch of sort of back stuff that I've done, old stuff that I've written and drawn. You can go check it out.
All right. Excellent. So listeners, viewers, you heard the man. Go check out his stuff, follow him, and make sure that you support Little Black Book. All right.
Woo.